Anyway, I got something kind of interesting to go over this evening, and it really kind of does show you that history repeats itself. I mean, in some ways, I hope not, but I mean, it kind of does. It's odd. It's really weird. Like, one of the things that I have found the most fascinating when I've researched history, specifically Jewish influence throughout the world, it's amazing how cyclical it is. And it's amazing how identical, I mean, almost identical, a lot of these patterns are. I mean, in some cases, it's the same players, it's the same names, it's really odd. And that's what I discovered when I started looking into a man by the name of Robert E. Edmondson. Now, Robert E., the E is for Edward, Edmondson, was a journalist who began writing about Jewish power around, specifically around the FDR administration. He was famous for writing a book by the name of I Testify Against the Jews. By the way, here's another thing that's really weird. You try to find hard copies of a lot of this stuff, and it's almost impossible. And when you can find it, it's like on eBay for like $2,000 and like ridiculous shit like that. Like there were a few books that I just ran into the titles while doing this research, not necessarily just by him, but by other like affiliates of his or people who were also researching Jews. Some of whom were published some of them were self-published, right? But some of them were published in, I think one was by Random House Publishing, and it's impossible. It's impossible to find some of this stuff. And I'm sure some of it exists on PDF, but archive.org is still down. That was a little bit of a speed bump for tonight, but it didn't stop me. But it did slow a few things down. There was a lot of things that would probably have been a lot easier to find. But I just found that stunning. There's a lot of books that I'd find the names of some associates of this guy and or some of his original books, and you try to find them, and it's like, oh yeah, you can buy it on eBay for $2,000. But anyway, he wrote I Testify Against the Jews. That's probably one of his most famous publications. But he was also very anti-FDR and was convinced that FDR was in fact Jewish. And there are probably going to be a lot of people who think that, FDR is probably not Jewish. But let me explain perhaps why he might have come to this conclusion. You got to remember, this is a time before the internet. I believe this publication was from 1936, and he's limited by what he can, get in the library and public records and such. And what he did was he found that the earliest known ancestor of FDR was Claes Marsdenson van Rosenvelt. And that's real. I looked into it. That is real. That is the real name. And we don't really know where he came from. We believe that he was Dutch, that the family was a mix of Dutch and French. They were Protestants, Episcopalians. The family is Episcopalian. Episcopalian, that's like ruling class WASP Protestants. Like Tucker Carlson, I believe, is Episcopalian, and he also wears a Kabbalah bracelet. So there's always that. The Episcopalian, from what I understand, is very similar, if not even connected to the Church of England, because it's the ruling class Protestants from old money families. But that was the evidence he had to go by. It was just the fact that, well, that sounds pretty Jewy. And you might think, well, that's pretty tenuous, right? You're just gonna say that he's Jewish because one of his ancestors has a kind of Jewy name. And it's like, well, not really. He was also a big Zionist. He was a big Zionist, and in fact, this I found this interesting. This is an article talking about Emanuel Seller of the Hart-Celler Act, where it says Representative Emanuel Seller, who called on President Truman at the White House, told reporters that Truman stands solidly behind Roosevelt's stand on Zionism. The president will not deviate one iota from the platform of the Democratic Party, which calls for a democratic Jewish commonwealth in Palestine. So Roosevelt was a big-time Zionist, and you might say, well, that's not too crazy. I mean, okay, so one of his ancestors, their last name sounds kind of Jewy, and he's a Zionist. I mean, fuck, he's an American politician. How many of them aren't Zionists? Well, back in the 30s, quite a lot of them, actually. But then you take a look at Roosevelt's administration and his closest advisors. For example, I mean, just already, I mean, you look up Jew in the dictionary. That is Henry Morgenthau. Henry Morgenthau, of course, famously of the Morgenthau Plan, the vindictive plan that was rolled out to punish Germany after World War II. He was the Jew that devised that plan. But he was also... Oops, my notes got all weird for some reason. He was also the U.S. Secretary of Treasury for FDR. He was one of FDR's closest advisors, especially in economic and financial matters, of course. He played a key role in shaping the New Deal. The New Deal, which basically redefined the role and purpose of the federal government, and some would even say the structure and really the character of our country forever. He was also instrumental in financing World War II. He was always pushing for the United States' involvement into World War II prior to us entering the war. And he was also very instrumental in welcoming the Jewish refugees from Europe before, during, and after World War II. So you might say, well, I mean, that's one guy. It's a Secretary of Treasury. So he's got a Secretary of Treasury that's Jewish. That's not really that big of a deal, except for we got this guy, Felix Frankfurter, one of the first Jews nominated to the Supreme Court appointed by FDR. He was the Associate Justice.
Elevate your space with a handcrafted, eco-friendly wooden masterpiece. Mark your travels, plan new adventures, or gift a memorable experience. This eco-friendly decor is simple to install, built to last, and backed by a lifetime warranty. Click the screen to explore it now.
Of the Supreme Court from 1939 to 1962. He was a close personal friend of FDR and one of his many legal and political advisors before his Supreme Court appointment. He was also the co-founder of the ACLU, a Jewish organization, not unlike the ADL, that used the exploited vulnerabilities in the Constitution and in constitutional law to defend pornographers and other degenerates. In fact, at some point, they even had to bend the knee to try to look as if they weren't just there to help out Jewish interests. And I think in a couple instances, they even supported Nazis. That, of course, has all gone out the window. You won't see the ACLU sticking up for, say, streamers that get demonetized or kicked off of YouTube for free speech issues. So you might think, okay, so big deal. So he appointed a Jewish Supreme Court justice. No big deal. Well, there's always this guy, too. This is Benjamin Cohen, FDR's legal advisor and member of Roosevelt's Brain Trust, is what they called it. You know, those big brain Jews. They called it the Brain Trust. Cohen was a key architect of the New Deal legislation. He was particularly focused on the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935. Working with fellow Jew Thomas Cochran Cohen, and was instrumental in formulating many of the legal foundations of the New Deal. So you're like, okay, well, big deal. So there's a few Jews within his inner circle. It happens. You got this guy, Samuel Rosenman. This was FDR's speechwriter. FDR's speechwriter was a Jew. He served as speechwriter and legal counsel, so he was also FDR's lawyer. He was one of FDR's main speechwriters, and he came up with the term New Deal. He helped draft all of FDR's major addresses, sometimes just writing them entirely himself, and remained a key advisor throughout World War II, and handled all the public messaging for World War II. That's interesting. So we got a lot of Jews close to FDR, kind of administrating the World War II so far. All right. Starting to think where maybe this guy's coming from, thinking maybe FDR is a little Jewish. I don't know, but yeah. So his speechwriter, Supreme Court Justice, Secretary of Treasury. I mean, it's not a bit. Now there's this guy, Herbert Lehman. Now he was governor of New York from 1933 to 1942. He was Director General of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. So not only was he governor of New York while FDR was president, and he campaigned with FDR, but he was also put in charge of a lot of the new responsibilities that were coming out of the UN that was being developed after World War II. And he administered a lot of the distribution of aid going to other countries post-World War II. So we got a Jew in charge of that. Okay. Well, it's not that weird, I guess, right? We got this guy, David Niles. David Niles was the advisor on minority affairs, obviously including Jewish issues. He was a key advisor on minority issues, including matters related to Jewish refugees and the broader Jewish community. He also served as an advisor on the Jewish affairs for Presidents Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower. So he was like the Jewish liaison for 3 presidents, but he started under Roosevelt's administration. Okay, well, you gotta have a Jewish liaison, right? I mean, right? That's not too abnormal to have a Jewish liaison. And we have this guy, Louis Brandeis. I think that's how you say it. I'm not sure. He was another Jewish Supreme Court justice put on the court by FDR. Wow, 2. 2 of the first ever. In fact, there had only been 1 other prior to that. So he doubled the amount of Jews that had ever been on the court. Okay, that's interesting. He was particularly... actually, this is the wrong Jew. There's another one. This guy was on the court. This is the first Jew on the court. But he was on the court during... There's another Jew coming up. This guy was the first Jew on the Supreme Court. And so he was appointed before Roosevelt. But he served during the Roosevelt presidency. And he was an advisor to FDR, particularly on matters related to Zionism and the Jewish community. He was a vocal advocate of Jewish causes and played an indirect but important role in the advocating Zionism under the FDR administration. Okay. Well, so it's starting to be a lot of Jews. We have this chick. Well, she's not a Jew though. She's not a Jew. She's just a blue-haired feminist. She's like the proto blue-haired feminist who is tightly wrapped up in with Jewish organizations. Her name was Frances Perkins. She was the Secretary of Labor. And while she wasn't Jewish herself, she worked closely with Jewish leaders, some of whom I've already named, and labor activists. In other words, communists. She was a communist. Let's just not beat around the bush. She was a communist, and she was the liaison between the FDR administration and Jewish communists. I mean, I want to not try to gussy it up. That's basically what her job was. And so she was the go-between between FDR and Jewish communists in the labor movements going on in the United States at the time. Okay. Well, no big deal, right? At least she wasn't a Jew. Who's this? This is Sidney Hillman. He was also a labor advisor. His position was leader of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. He was the key labor advisor to FDR. He was a communist. He was one of those communists I was just mentioning. Strong supporter of FDR and the New Deal, which was an effort to make the United States more communist. He served as a key labor advisor to FDR and played a major role in mobilizing labor support for the president. So in other words, he got those commie votes, those labor union votes in for FDR, especially during World War II, because when that war machine started going, a lot of his clients were making a lot of money producing those war machines. Okay, well, some labor Jews, a bunch of other... Oh, look at this guy. This is Isidore Lubin, economic advisor. He was the commissioner of labor statistics, as well as an economic advisor to FDR. He was an important economic advisor to FDR, particularly on the labor and economic data. He played a key role in shaping the New Deal labor policies and was a trusted statistician who provided vital economic information during Roosevelt's administration. There seems to be like a whole lot of Jews that seem to be behind this New Deal thing.
Avoid these 3 foods like the plague.
Whole milk or almond milk?
Neither.
What milk do you guys like to drink?
We drink oat milk because it doesn't cause inflammation like real milk does.
Yep.
Salad or bread?
It's bread for us at every meal. Most salad is less nutritious than it was back in the 70s. Modern farming's ripping nutrients straight out of our food.
Well, you both look amazing. So what do you do to stay in shape?
We discovered something that's changed our lives for the better, and for our friends too. Isn't that right, honey?
I'm in my 80s. I've never seen anything work this fast. Everyone's body has a built-in code. This code predicts how your body will age. I call it your aging type. And if you know it, it could help you dramatically improve your health. That's why I created this simple quiz that'll determine which age type fits you best and allow you to finally feel like a younger, healthier version of yourself. It was only after I learned my own age profile that I was able to choose the right diet for my body. In fact, I started feeling better in a matter of days. Answer just 6 simple questions. You won't be asked for your email or for anything else for that matter. We've kept the quiz short, simple, and free. So go ahead and click the link below to find out your aging type and get the crucial tips you need to feel amazing today.
That seems like a lot of Jews. I mean, this is very unusual. I don't know. We got this guy, Julius Rosenwald. Julius Rosenwald, who was he was basically just a turbo Jew money Jew. You know, the kind of Jew money where you just get called, oh, he's a philanthropist, which just means he's got an infinite ball of money. And he was a big donor to FDR. But also, he was a big donor to African-American organizations that Jews were just starting to spin up. One might say he was also a communist, and that was the motivation for creating these African-American organizations that would later on blossom into the organizations that we know and love today. He served as an advisor relating to Jewish charities and refugees. Big donor, big Jew donor, advising FDR on what we should do with all these Jewish refugees. Okay, well, then we got this guy, Joseph Proskauer. He was a judge, an advisor, and legal counsel for FDR. He was a prominent Jewish judge, advised FDR on Jewish issues. That's odd. I wonder if there was anyone advising him on Christian issues, or Muslim issues, or Buddhist issues for that matter, particularly related to the refugees from Europe. Oh, look at that. Another rich money Jew advising FDR on what we should do with all these European Jews that were flooding into our country. He was president of the American Jewish Committee during the war and worked closely with Roosevelt on Jewish refugee matters. So in other words, another money Jew making sure that the gates were wide open for all those European Jews flooding into our country before, during, and after World War II. Okay, well, all right, so there's some definite Jewish influence there, but this doesn't seem that crazy. There's another one. Nathan Strauss, administrator and advisor. He was the head of the U.S. Housing Authority. That's a nice position to have when you're crafting the New Deal. I wonder if he had any input on where we put all of these Jewish refugees. He's also just a big money Jew. He's the kind of big money Jew that didn't really have a job. He's called a philanthropist. Oh, philanthropist. Where do you go to school to become that? I sure wish I had a degree in philanthropy. Seems like it pays really well. He worked closely with FDR on housing reform and public welfare projects, and basically helped expand the welfare programs that would later lead to places like Bessemer. You want to know why white flight would happen a few decades later? Well, you're looking at it. That was a big part of it. A lot of federal money giving black people free places to live right in the middle of white neighborhoods, while also providing housing for Jews flooding into the country before, during, and after World War II. Okay, well, all right, no big deal. You know, it's another Jew. I got another one. Got Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, another Jewish advisor on Jewish affairs. You know, that's another thing about FDR. He seems to have a lot of advisors on Jewish affairs. It's an odd title. Seems to be an awful lot of these guys that have that title. He was a prominent Zionist leader. He was a major leader in the American Jewish community, frequently communicated with FDR about Jewish matters, especially concerning the situation of European Jews flooding into the country before, during, and after World War II. I'm starting to pick up on a pattern here. It's a little bit odd. I'm kind of seeing a little bit of a pattern here. I'm sure that's not going to keep. Oh my God! Lawrence Steinhardt. Lawrence Steinhardt was an ambassador. He was the ambassador to Turkey and the Soviet Union. Well, that's kind of a key position, right? Especially during World War II. So you've got a Jew that is now the ambassador to the Soviet Union during World War II. You've got the guy who's bankrolling World War II who's Jewish. You got the guy writing all the speeches for FDR. He's Jewish. You have all of his legal counsel that are Jewish. The guys writing the New Deal, they're all Jewish. You know, it's funny. I don't know about you guys. It's been a long time since I was in elementary school. But I couldn't get over, in fact, a lot of that stuff in one ear and out the other. But if there's one thing that stuck with me and it was consistent, was how every year when we would do American history, you know, every grade, you know, they have varying levels of complexity as you get older, but they always seem to cover the New Deal. And the teachers always seemed to really like FDR. And I thought it was odd at the time because they also seemed to hate other presidents. And I was a kid, I couldn't really put it together. But one thing that I could very easily understand at that age was, wow, all these teachers really like FDR. My textbook really likes FDR. And as much as they love FDR, and we watch movies, which also is weird. All the Hollywood movies seems to depict FDR as like this really great guy. I don't think I've ever seen a film, and I don't think one exists, where FDR is anything but a hero. You often hear how many times did you have to hear the quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself"? They hammered it into your head. And I would contrast that to, say, like Nixon, who was the exact opposite. They fucking hated Nixon. Nixon was the devil. And I could never really put it together. And I remember talking to my mom about it at one point, even saying, "Mom, do we like FDR?" My mom did not like FDR. She was a conservative and saw saw him as the beginning of big government, which is not inaccurate. And so I thought that was weird that my mom didn't like this FDR guy, but every year, every teacher couldn't shut up about him. And every textbook would tell you how awesome it was and how the United States wasn't even like a real country until the New Deal. And again, all the movies that you watched, FDR was like some kind of fucking saint. It was very odd. Very odd. Well, anyway, I'm sure that's the end of that list, right? Who's this guy? James Warburg, a financial advisor and another member of the Brain Trust. The James Warburg Jew that is often quoted as having said, "We shall have world government whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by consent or by conquest." He was a big banker Jew. I guess maybe they call him a philanthropist. I don't know. I think at a certain point, maybe there's like a line. Maybe you get too rich to be a philanthropist. Like, philanthropist is like, you're fucking rich, but you're not like Warburg banker rich. You're one of his biggest clients, maybe, his bank. But it's a different class. But they had what was called Warburg's proteges, I think it was. No, it was Frankfurter's proteges. And that included Jerome Frank, another Jew. These Jews they're very good-looking people, wouldn't you say? Very handsome, very eugenic-looking people. He was another lawyer that helped shape the New Deal. And you might say, and there was a whole pack of them. They called them Frankfurter's proteges. It was basically a bunch of Jews that had clerked for or worked under Frankfurter and were basically distributed throughout the government as it massively expanded to accommodate the New Deal. All these new bureaucracies were being created. All these new institutions that many of them still exist today were being drawn out of thin air, and installed at the top of each one of these bureaucracies was one of these Jews, one of these proteges. Now you might say to me, "Devin, you're being a little unfair. I happen to know that a big portion of Biden's administration is Jewish. A big portion of Trump's administration is Jewish. I guess you can say that the United States has always had these kinds of powerful Jews in government. FDR is not an anomaly, right? He's not an anomaly. Surely, if you look at, I don't know, how about this? How about we just look back at the administration before FDR? After all, FDR did not appoint the first Jewish justice. That happened before him. He simply appointed the second and third. But, come on, out of the 75 close advisors that he had, only 50 of them were Jews. That's a realistic number. Out of the 75 close advisors that FDR had, 50 of them were Jews. But again, you can say, well, that's totally normal. That's totally normal, right? That's something that had been going on a long time. But you'd be wrong. If you look back at Herbert Hoover, who was president from 1929 to 1933, just prior to FDR, the man that FDR defeated, we'll get into that in a moment, he didn't have a single Jewish advisor or cabinet member. His administration was described as homogeneous in terms of ethnicity and religion. His cabinet and key appointees were primarily composed of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And men, obviously. They're all men. So we went from zero Jews in any kind of influential position in the federal government to about 50 out of 75 Jews under FDR. So you might understand why people would come to the conclusion that FDR must be Jewish, because it's hard to explain that kind of a shift. It's very difficult to explain that kind of a shift. And speaking of that shift, you might wonder, well, how is the public sold on that kind of a dramatic change? How would the American public elect someone like Hoover, who had a pretty much 100% white wasp male administration, and then run into the arms of a socialist, if not a Jew himself, someone who's, an aspiring Jew like FDR? Well, there's two things you got to think about what was going on during Hoover's presidency. And what kind of policies would Hoover have that would have dramatically depart from, say, the Jewish advisors of FDR, their worldview? Well, if you're looking at the context, he became president in 1929, served till 1933. We were coming at the end of the Roaring '20s, and the Great Depression was about to hit. The Great Depression that many have argued was, in fact, triggered and exacerbated and kept going as a result of the actions of the newly formed Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve that purposely kept funds unavailable for banks as they failed, wouldn't lower interest rates, and some have argued was the engineer of the Great Depression. Why would they want to engineer an economic depression during the presidency of Herbert Hoover? Well, another thing about Herbert Hoover is he was a strong advocate of staying out of World War II, like most Americans, like most white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant males at the time. Of course, the press didn't like that. The press was largely Jewish. The press was calling him a dangerous isolationist. They were blaming him and his policies for the bad economy. They said the whole world's going to go to hell in a handbasket under this guy. He's dangerous. And what happened just a few short years later after FDR was elected president? Well, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this clip.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation and, at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us, no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion. The American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the...
Avoid these three foods like the plague.
Whole milk or almond milk?
Neither.
What milk do you guys like to drink?
We drink oat milk because it doesn't cause inflammation like real milk does.
Yep.
Salad or bread?
It's bread for us at every meal. Most salad is less nutritious than it was back in the 70s. Modern farming's ripping nutrients straight out of our food.
Well, you both look amazing. So what do you do to stay in shape?
We discovered something that's changed our lives for the better, and for our friends too. Isn't
inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
And so the United States entered World War II. Now you can say, well, but Japan did attack us. And yes, they did. You can say that it was at the urging of Adolf Hitler, which I believe there is evidence for also. But you could also say we were aware that the attack was coming. The American intelligence, Army intelligence was aware that the attack was coming and let it happen, so that it would be as devastating as possible, so as to get support for a war that the Americans still didn't want to get involved in. A war, by the way, that we were already involved in. This was just a formality. Just like today, you can say we're not at war with Russia, as an example, but would a war between Ukraine and Russia be going on if it wasn't for American support? No. So in a manner of speaking, we kind of are. You can say that we are not at war with the Palestinians or Iran or Hezbollah. But if Israel didn't have all the foreign aid and American-made weaponry, that also wouldn't be occurring. So in a manner of speaking, we kind of are. And just like in December of 1941, while we weren't officially at war, we were still providing weapons to England and to allies and allied forces in Europe, which is precisely why Hitler thought it would be a strategically good idea if the Japanese kept us busy in the Pacific. By the way, I want you to take a look at these microphones. There were only two networks at the time, really, CBS and NBC. You also see MBS. MBS was a really small network that played like radio dramas, like Superman. But it doesn't matter because the same is true for MBS. CBS, at the time, was run by William S. Paley, Jewish. NBC was run by David Sarnoff, a Russian Jew, who came to America around the turn of the century. And MBS was owned by Jewish shareholders, or at least the majority stake was. Also, the New York Times, the paper of record at the time, run by Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, also Jewish. So at the time that America entered World War II, 50 out of the 75 key people close to the president were Jewish. The largest media networks, and really almost to the extent where it was pretty much 100%, was Jewish. So that's the environment. That's the environment in which Robert Edward Edmondson found himself trying to wrap his head around what the fuck was going on. What the hell was going on in America? There's the Jewish-owned New York Times. U.S. declares war. Now, Robert Edward Edmondson thought it was strange to have so many Jews in these positions, when at the time, 95% of the United States was Christian. They were WASPs. They were white, Anglo-Saxon Christian. I mean, I guess at that time you also had a lot of Catholics, Irish Catholics, and but European Christians, you could say. But 95%, regardless of denomination, they were Christian. And so he thought it was odd that in a country like that, you would have so many Jews in these really key positions, not just officially, but unofficially, and in media, and in these influential positions in the private sector, and in banking. And so he started to imagine, if you read the history books, it was all in his head, imagine that perhaps there was a Jewish conspiracy that was seeking to dominate world governments. Because it wasn't just the United States that was experiencing all these powerful Jews just popping up in positions of power. A lot of the Jews that had showed up around the turn of the century did so because of the Russian Revolution, and the Soviet Union had a similar Jewish population in the ruling class. Robert Edmondson began to wonder if perhaps this was a type of Bolshevik revolution taking place in the United States. He also couldn't understand why Jews seemed to be unique in their inability to conform to the social norms of the Americans. Why, when most Europeans would show up, the Italians, the Irish, the Spanish, the French, maybe you'd have ethnic neighborhoods and whatever, but by and large, within a generation or two, these kids or grandkids sounded just like all the other Americans. They assimilated. And that's what was expected of the Jewish immigrants that came around the turn of the century, when the Americans opened up the gates and welcomed them in. They were told that they were going to assimilate just like everybody else. But of course, as I covered in the Postville stream, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it, here's a clip from that documentary. That's just not how Jews roll.
They all wanted to be folded into the local society. The Jews did not. Hasidic Jews in Postville really don't care what the locals think. They just will operate the same way they have operated, whether it's in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York, or whether it's in Postville. It really doesn't make any difference. People have to understand them, their rules and their procedures. They're really not terribly interested in fitting in. They don't want to fit in.
The truth of the matter is, in order to be kosher, you have to be somewhat separate. By its very nature, we can't eat the foods that they eat. And it isn't that we don't want to like them or be with them. It's that we just can't be with them. And we have to maintain some separateness. And even to protect our own children from assimilation, we have to keep them separate.
They have to keep them separate to protect them from assimilation. So the Jews coming to America were actively resisting assimilation. They had no desire to assimilate, and why would they? They're God's chosen people. You're not God's chosen people. It's your job to know about their customs. They don't need to know about yours. They're the top of the hierarchy. So Edmondson was noticing things. He was noticing that there were a lot of powerful Jews in finance, a lot of powerful Jews in politics and culture. He thought that Jews had played not only a role in orchestrating the involvement of the United States into World War II, but also World War I. He thought that the Jews were behind communism, which, that's pretty much, I think, an established, accepted fact at this point. That's not weird crackpot theory to think that the Bolshevik Revolution was a Jewish revolution, that Leon Trotsky, his real name was Lev Bronstein, and the people financing the Bolshevik Revolution were banker Jews, some of whom were in America, some of whom worked closely with FDR. He saw a disproportionate amount of control from Jewish bankers and financial institutions. He accused Jewish individuals or some of the FDR's advisors for working towards not what was best for Americans, but what was best for world Jewry. He said that Jews controlled all the major media outlets, I just showed you that they did at the time, and used their influence to manipulate public opinion to go along with the policies that were being enacted by the Jews in political positions. Synergy. We talked last stream about synergy. About how in the 90s you had Jewish CEOs of clothing companies like at places like The Gap and, Guess Jeans and Jordache and Victoria's Secret, all these 90s brands that were all run by Jews, and the synergy that took place between these fashion Jews that were promoting the fashions and trying to make things fads and make, that's the clothes you have to be the cool kid at school. You have to have that label because I watched a popular TV show and the famous actress or the famous actor was wearing that outfit. Well, the reason they were wearing that outfit was because the person producing that TV show was also a Jew. And that's how this synergistic nepotism worked. And the same was with policy when it came to the federal government. And we see it today. It's not even like something that you can question. In fact, if there's anything that should make you suspicious, is if the media is all of a sudden praising a particular candidate, you can almost, with certainty, say, in some way that person is serving Jewish interests. And the same situation existed back then. There just wasn't any internet. Edmondson focused on the Rothschild banking dynasty, and of course, he made the observations that many of us are familiar with today about how they played both sides of wars, they financed both sides of wars. That's, again, at this point, it's just a historical fact that most people accept at this, but this was really edgy stuff back then. He also suggested that all these Jewish judges that were being appointed, because it wasn't just the Supreme Court, but also federal judges were being put in place so that they could uphold the quote-unquote constitutional muster of some of these new laws that really didn't hold up. If they were interpreted the way that they should have been by a goy judge, they would not have become law or remained law. Here's a quote from Robert Edward Edmondson. Knowing that pitiless publicity is the only cure for public evils, in 1934, I started on a campaign to expose Jewish anti-Americanism and Talmudic communism, which has been called the Code of Hell, a rabbi racket that victimizes its own followers, an international satanic system subverting France, Britain, Germany, and Russia, causing the present depression and moving to take over the United States through Jewish radical administration. So he started publishing his own pamphlets, his own leaflets, and his own books. He was a journalist by trade. He was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1872. His first job, he worked as a reporter in Ohio at the Cincinnati Post. And then he moved to New York and became a financial reporter for the New York Herald. Also worked for the New York Mail and the New York Express, obviously not the New York Times. That's where he began to notice some of these things, because he was an economist and he was covering financial news for big newspapers in New York. And he saw up close and personal what he called the manipulation of the economy by Jews. And he suspected that they had some of this manipulation was what was behind the Great Depression that helped usher in FDR's presidency. He made the Roosevelt pamphlet calling Roosevelt a Jew and claimed that Roosevelt was mutating our government from a form of republicanism, from a republic to a democracy. You know, people like to say, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Well, that might have been true before the New Deal, before FDR, but we have been pretty much operating as a democracy since. His contention was democracy was a flawed system because it was so easily manipulated by people like Jews who had access to media and, banking and all the things they had access to. It was the perfect form of government for Jews because they had the ability to reprogram NPCs at will. So even if they had to vote on things, they knew how to get the vote that they wanted, especially back then. Not only was there no internet, there wasn't even like any other newspapers. Or there was no other information, period. He started his own paper called the Edison Economic Service, and he published over 400 papers. And in fact, between 1934 and 1936, he distributed over 5 million pieces of literature. So he was like the alternative news of the time. And this became a thorn in the side of the Jews that were running the FDR administration. They had total control, for the most part, over the messaging. And here you've got this uppity goy publishing all these papers and handing out all these pamphlets and flyers and writing books, talking about how, why are there all these Jews everywhere? Why do we all of a sudden have Jews running everything? And so on July 11th, 1936, we'll get to that in a second. That's another thing he did. Edmondson was indicted by a grand jury in New York. A grand jury made up of a majority of Jews, in New York, so, go figure. Charged with, quote, libeling all persons of the Jewish religion. They indicted him for libeling all the Jews. That was the charge. They were going to put him in prison for blood libel. This wasn't that long ago. This was less than 100 years ago. This is 1936. They were able to put a grand jury together in 1936 and indict him for libeling all Jews. So here's a article about this. This is another thing he wrote. He wrote under a pen name, B'nai B'rith, an international anti-Christian pro-communist Jewish power. So he wrote a book on B'nai B'rith being a secret society hell-bent on the destruction of the Goy, essentially. I'm sure that didn't make him happy either. Edmondson versus the People, New York, Robert Edward Edmondson, notorious anti-Semite and red baiter, because he talks about communists, has been charged by the grand jury with 3 indictments for criminal libel, misdemeanor of libeling all persons of the Jewish religion, libeling Dean Virginia Gildersleeve of Bernard College and Francis Perkins, Secretary of Labor. On August 11th, he filed a printed brief with the General Sessions Court. Edmondson demonstrated contempt for the court proceedings by printing in the brief a large part of the libelous matter, which appeared first in the leaflets on the basis of which he was being tried. He also printed a 64-page pamphlet, magazine size, which included not only the brief, but somewhat elaborated upon, but also the correspondence connected with the case, an alleged report on the jurors, the Jewish jurors, the affidavits, and the argument of the counsel. This pamphlet has been placed on sale under the title, The Edmondson Case. I tried to find a copy of that, and like I said, if archive.org was up, I might have been able to find it. In the brief, Edmondson submitted to the court, he ascribes political motives to the mayor, Fiorello L. LaGuardia, who he calls the Jewish mayor. This was one of these Italian mobster mayors that had a lot of Jewish ties. The jury he charges includes Mongol Jews. That was one term I can never quite figure out, that got thrown around a lot around this time period. Mongol Jews. Whom he also calls Negro Semitic Jews. I don't know what the term... what that's a reference to. He quotes as authorities the forged protocols of the Elders of Zion, obviously fake, the Fascist of Great Britain, the New York American Hearst, a Canadian fascist publication, the Reverend Gerald B. Windward, ardent Jew baiter of Wichita, Kansas, and others. Among the crimes which Edmondson lays at the door of the Jewish people is that far back in ancient times they were the first to cry liberty, equality, and fraternity, and that today they are opposing the patriots who are now revolting in Spain. It is significant that Edmondson, like Hearst and Coughlin, Father Coughlin, also attacks the gold standard. It is well known that Hearst and Coughlin profited from silver. The General Sessions Court will do the people of the United States an important service if it will unearth the financial supporters of Robert Edward Edmondson. So they go after him, and it's funny because the way he gets out of it, aside from it, that's, it just never would have held up. And I don't even know if they intended it to. Because a lot of this, it's lawfare. It's the same playbook as it always is. it's lawfare. The government can afford to prosecute you for eternity because their budget is unlimited, especially if it's the federal government. In this case, I think it was just New York. But New York had a lot. I mean, that's like, I guess, second place if you're in America at that time. And so really what they're doing is they're forcing him to spend a lot of time and energy fighting these charges and trying to get out of it. But it was funny because the way that they charged him with libeling all Jews, they kind of left the door open to him having a unique defense strategy. And his unique defense strategy was he subpoenaed all the prominent Jews. Because he's being charged with libeling all Jews, he was able to subpoena Bernard Baruch, Henry Morgenthau, Rabbi Weiss, Samuel Utenmeyer, Mayor LaGuardia, James Warburg, Walter Lippmann, Justice Samuel Rosenman, and a bunch of others that would have to appear at court, and he would get to cross-examine them. And so, of course, they backpedaled because they realized that this was all stupid, and dismissed the case. This is an article here. Court rules law does not cover religious libel. Case against Edmondson dismissed on the ground that the whole group cannot be libeled. Well, I mean, obviously, but that was the real reason it got dismissed because he started subpoenaing like the richest Jews in New York. The indictment against Robert Edward Edmondson, anti-Semitic pamphleter for libeling the Jewish religion, has been dismissed by Judge James G. Wallace of General Sessions Court on the grounds that New York State's law did not cover group libel. In this decision, Judge Wallace denounced Edmondson, but held it was wiser to bear with the scandal-mongering than to extend the criminal law to become an instrument of oppression. Judge Wallace also dismissed on his own motion indictments against Edmondson, alleging that he had libeled Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins and Dean Virginia C. Gildersleeve of Bernard College, on the grounds that these indictments on their face do not set forth a crime. Dismissal of the indictments was sought recently by 5 organizations, including the American Jewish Congress. That's because, see, this is what this is the funny part of the story. They dismissed it because the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, filed briefs asking that the case get dismissed because if it wasn't, he'd be allowed to go ahead and subpoena these turbo Jews and cross-examine them. So, clever little trick that got the Jews nervous, and so they went ahead. There can be no doubt as the defamatory nature of the publications mentioned, Judge Wallace said in his 19-page decision. They are palpably the outpourings of a fanatical and bigoted mind. Nevertheless, they have never provoked a breach of the peace in the community, nor in spite of their virulence are they apt to, stressing that we must suffer the demagogue and the charlatan in order to make certain that we do not limit or restrain the honest commentator on public affairs. Judge Wallace stated regarding the legal aspect of the case, it may be, as the learned district attorney suggests, that the general construction law permits us to construe the word person to mean persons or a number of individuals, and of course, a malicious publication which has the tendency to injure any person, corporation, or association in their business or preoccupation is indictable under the penal law. So they wanted to leave the door open in case they wanted to get someone for libeling an entire group later on. He didn't want to set precedent, is basically why he had to make sure to say that in his decision. So he gets out of that one. That's 1936. But again, after 1936, FDR, his first attempt to silence one of his critics, has failed. We haven't quite declared war yet with Japan. And this is FDR addressing the nation, talking about like I said, this is like the proxy war stuff. This is essentially what we're doing now. I'll tell you what, I still err on the side of World War III is not around the corner, but I get why people are saying that. And this is kind of why people are saying it. A lot of what happened prior to World War II is happening now for the same reasons. It's the same groups, it's powerful Jews trying to get America to go fight their wars for them. And the same sorts of events prior to what happened in World War II are kind of happening now, right? Where you have the clamp down on anti-Semitism, well, everywhere except for on X, I guess, right now. We'll see how long that lasts. While we also simultaneously have a proxy war going on. And that's what FDR here is about to talk about, is he's prepping the American people, trying to convince them that we need to enter World War II because we are fighting the great evil. The Nazis must be stopped. Look, this is very similar to the kind of speech you would hear about, from an American politician today, talking about either the war in Ukraine or what's going on with Gaza. It's literally the same kind of rhetoric.
Never before, since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, has our American civilization
been in such danger as now. Frankly and definitely, there is danger ahead. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger or the fear of it by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas, and they will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun loaded with explosive bullets, economic as well as military. The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis. No.
Want to know why they don't sell this little green laser at the shooting range? Because if you had it, you'd never waste another round zeroing again. No lane fees, no ammo costs, and it only takes 10 seconds to do it at home. This thing is killing their business.
This is the bore sighter by MCG Tactical. Drop it into your barrel, turn it on, line it up with your scope with the green laser dot. You just got a perfect zero without firing a single shot. No trips to the range, no guessing, no spending 25 bucks on ammo just to get it on paper. And yeah, it works with every caliber. Your 17 HMR, your 308, even your 12 gauge slug gun. You can use it anywhere, in your office, in your garage, even at camp. No mag, no trigger, just precision. And the best part, you can use it over and over again. Every time you change optics, every time you bump your rifle, every time you want to be sure you're still dialed in. And right now, we've got a limited drop. Normally, these laser sighters run up to 200.
Man can tame a tiger into a kitten by stroking it. There can be no appeasement with ruthlessness. There can be no reasoning with an incendiary bomb. We know now that a nation that can have peace with the Nazis only at the price of total surrender. The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war.
Again, it's the same exact rhetoric. Israel doesn't want us to fight their wars, they just need some aid. Ukraine doesn't want us to fight their war, they just need some aid. It's identical. Identical.
Planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and our security. We have furnished the British great material support, and we will furnish far more in the future. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. No dictator, no combination of dictators will weaken that determination by threats of how they will construe that determination. This nation is making a great effort to produce everything that is necessary in this emergency, and with all possible speed. This great effort requires great sacrifice. The nation expects our defense industries to continue operation without interruption by strikes or lockouts. It expects and insists that management and workers will reconcile their differences by voluntary or legal means to continue to produce the supplies that are so sorely needed. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. I believe that the Axis powers are not going to win this war. I base that belief on the latest and the best information. As President of the United States, I call for that national. I call for it in the name of this nation, which we love and honor, and which we are privileged and proud to serve. I call upon our people with absolute confidence that our common cause will greatly succeed.
And again, every last word of that speech was written by a Jew, as were all of his speeches. So in response to this kind of rhetoric heating up in the United States, again, most Americans did not want to get involved in the war. This is prior to Pearl Harbor. Edmondson began passing out more and more flyers, and the rhetoric, while I don't think it's as sophisticated as perhaps it could be, it's very similar to what you hear the fears that people have today about Americans getting involved in Jewish wars.
The little bit of information that is out there today about Edmondson is pretty much buried for obvious reasons. And if you do find anything, it will say he's a neo-Nazi. Well, let's look at this flyer, written, published, printed, and distributed by Edmondson himself, on his view of the war and how it ties exactly into the same war the Germans were fighting, only we were fighting the rhetorical part of the war over here. Armored Christian soldiers. Morning, noon, and night, the Jew-controlled press, radio, and movie newsreels are flooding this country with propaganda deliberately aimed at involving us in war. International Jew, Barak fellow traveler Ikes, Dorothy Thompson, Levi Kosher LaGuardia, and the whole Jew deal crowd are baiting friendly nations. The American people have no quarrel with Germany or Japan. They do not want to fight either nation, and neither do the Germans nor the Japanese want to fight us. The only people who want war are the Jews. Will the Jews do the fighting? No, they will make the profits. But hundreds of thousands of Christian American boys are to be killed and crippled and blinded on the altar of Jewish communism, because Germany and Europe and Japan and Asia are the enemies of Jewish Bolshevism.
Again, no more wars for Israel. We don't want our boys going across fighting these wars because they're the ones that are going to get mangled and killed. It's not going to be the Jews fighting the wars. They're going to be the ones that get rich and get the accomplish the objective that they were seeking to achieve militarily with our blood. And it wasn't just Robert Edmondson that was saying things like this. You had a very similar, I guess you could say, it's different because of the technology available, but you kind of had a similar cornucopia of anti-Semites. Instead of online doing streams or tweeting or making videos or passing out flyers or whatever, you had a disconnected group of people who were independently noticing the same kinds of issues that Edmondson was noticing, who were on their own, usually on their own dime, creating pamphlets, writing newsletters. In the case of Father Coughlin, was broadcasting on the radio. You had people that were leading demonstrations and protests, but it was very similar. A lot of these guys knew of each other, but they weren't affiliated. In the same way that, like, I know about other people who speak out against Jewish power. Maybe I've been on one of their streams once or twice or something like that, but I'm not like friends with these guys. I don't know them. We're not part of some kind of network, or anything like that. And so it's very similar. And a lot, and there's differences, right? People are motivated by different things. People are focused on different things. People prioritize different things. And what the federal government decided to do was to round them all up, and treat them as if they were all part of some anti-Semitic network. They were part of a seditious Nazi anti-Semitic network that were all working together, probably with the Nazis, in an effort to destroy the morale of the American people during a time of war.
Sedition trial opens in Washington. The FBI dragnet brings in a strange assortment of people, 30 in all, charged with scheming to establish a Nazi government in the United States. The case brings to light family intriguers apparently infatuated with Nazism. Mrs. Dilling, on the left, wrote a book, which didn't help her any. They hauled another plotter out of the army. But the pick of the bunch of pro-Hitlerites is Mrs. Lois de Lafayette Washburn, a flamboyant notoriety seeker who rips off a Nazi salute to her hero, Mr. Schicklgruber.
So they rounded up a bunch of people who were just pushing back against Jewish power. This wasn't that long ago. This is another one of those patterns that I suspect is a possibility. What would happen if we got involved in a actual war where we're sending troops to go fight Iran, or we're sending troops to go fight Russia, and you've got people that are in America pointing out that this is not in America's interests, that there are Jewish, powerful Jewish influences at work, working towards Jewish goals, and that white Christian American boys are going halfway around the world and getting maimed and murdered for something that doesn't do anything for us. That's not for us. Well, we have one example kind of already. Certainly it wasn't in America, but look what happened to Gonzalo Lira, a.k.a. Coach Red Pill. Now, again, you can say he was an idiot for staying in Ukraine, and why didn't he just stream from somewhere else? And I kind of suspect he was, this is I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but I kind of suspect he had health issues and wanted to go out with a bang and just didn't care anymore. And so he wasn't all that, he had a death wish, I think, on some level. That's just me speculating. But it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, that's the sort of thing we know can happen in today's world.
Los ahorros de Home Run están de vuelta y la venta de All-Star ya llegó a JK Chevrolet. Obtenga la oferta ganan ahorros en una nueva Chevrolet Silverado 2025. $10,000 en ahorros All-Star. Y no olvides que tenemos 0% fin Silverado. Sí, 0% financiamiento por tiempo limitado. Todos de ahorro o 0% de financiamiento. Apuesta y ahorra durante la venta All-Star.
En JK Chevrolet. Nuestra gente hace la diferencia.
Of course, that happened in Ukraine. But this happened in America in 1944. In 1944, we went around and rounded up anyone and everyone that was, quote-unquote, an anti-Semite. And they tried to connect them as if they were all part of some secret spy network working together, part of some conspiracy. And once again, you had the issue of, well, even if there's no basis for this case, you're up against the federal government. You got the FBI raiding your house. That's what they did. The FBI went to these people's homes, including Robert Edward Edmondson and some of the other people you just saw in the newsreel. They went to their homes, confiscated all of their papers. You know, computers didn't exist back then. Confiscated their personal journals. Essentially got any and all information that they ever put pen to paper. And so even if at that point, they can't make the case that they're trying to make, well, now maybe they can find some other way that you've violated federal law. Now that they have all your personal documents, and now you have to fight that case. And so you got all the legal fees. You got the fact that you can't be out there making money. You can't be, if you have a normal job. For a lot of these people, this wasn't like a full-time job. They had regular jobs. And now you're having to go defend yourself in Washington, D.C. And the way that they even did that was, because that's the other thing is, well, how did they get the venue of Washington, D.C.? A lot of these guys lived all over the country. Well, the way they did it was very sneaky. They would find one of these anti-Semites that was distributing disinformation, if you will, and they would request it from Washington, D.C. They would write them a letter saying, hey, I like your views on the Jews. Why don't you send me one of your newsletters? Well, once they did that, they could say, well, now you've committed sedition. You've broken this new law that we literally just passed just for this reason in order to rope you guys all into legal jeopardy. And we can try to say that you are Nazis.
In the World War II sedition trial, the power behind the government forced the indictment of those men and women who opposed the United States entering the war against Germany.
Many argue we're using it as a way of shutting down and eliminating from the public scene the America Firsters, the Bundists, and all the people that had opposed the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration and its prosecution of the war.
And yes, he did say the America Firsters. See, I told you there's a lot of weird symmetry between today and that time period. Yeah, I guess he was like the proto-Groyper, right? And that's what they get. What he's saying, what he's getting at, to put it in today's terms, he's saying it was weird because they were roping together. Again, I'll use today's terms. He was mixing up, or the federal government was essentially asserting that that people like Nick Fuentes were colluding with people like we'll just say Adam Green and TRS. Like they were all part of some big conspiracy together. You know, they would just go after anyone and everyone, and they said that they were all part of the same conspiracy, even though these were very different groups. That while there was some crossover, and while they all were challenging the legitimacy of Jewish power and trying to educate Americans who didn't have really access to information that wasn't Jewish, 99.9% of the time, they were trying to educate Americans on the presence of this Jewish influence and what exactly was going on right under their noses. But these guys were unaffiliated with each other. They had their own organizations spread all across the country at a time when there wasn't really even telephones necessarily that you couldn't even call each other. This is in the era of writing letters. And so part of Robert Edward Edmondson's defense, he had that clever defense or tactic before where he attempted to subpoena all these powerful Jews. Well, this time, part of their case was predicated on the idea that anti-Semitism necessarily meant that you were working with the Nazis. Like that's part of the way that they put it together. And you could say, like with Coach Red Pill, right? Like that was their reasoning was, well, you can't possibly be criticizing the Ukrainian government and doing what you're doing unless you're working for the Russians. And so it's the same kind of a thing, and the same kind of a thing that could take place in the United States if we go to World War III, if we start going to war with Israel's enemies, and we start having boots on the ground, and it becomes like kind of a mess, and it starts to drag on for years. You would have the federal government, at least with the precedent that they could there's laws in the books they could use like they did here to try to make the case that well, if you are challenging the reasons behind this war, the validity of this war, then you are working for the enemy. You are, in fact, you might remember, one of the last things that got passed by Obama, that got signed by Obama before Trump was sworn in, was that law that they, I can't remember the name of it now, but it was essentially that. It was essentially a law that gave the federal government more ability to charge people essentially for spreading disinformation if they worked for especially if they could make the case you worked for a foreign government. I forget it was a really weird thing though. For them. They pushed it through quick. Republicans too. They pushed it through quick right before Trump was sworn in 2016. So they have these laws on the books where they could go after people like me. They could go after anyone that has views like this, or even similar views, if it came down to a situation where people, I mean, they could essentially lock up anyone who's speaking out against the war that they end up getting us into if that happens. But anyway, part of the case here, part of the evidence that the state was making that proved that Edmondson was a Nazi spy was that they made the ridiculous claim that anti-Semitism did not exist in America prior to Hitler. That if you were an anti-Semite in America, you had to be, at the very least, influenced by Hitler. Because everyone loved Jews until Hitler came around and ruined it for them. And so he made the case, obviously, that this was ridiculous. And in fact, one of his examples was Ulysses S. Grant and his General Order Number 11. We've talked about this in previous streams. It was issued on December 17th, 1862. It was a military order that expelled Jews from areas under his command during the Civil War. And that was because Jews were being Jews during the Civil War. They were price gouging. They were smuggling in goods. They were, during the war, in war-torn parts of the country, Jewish merchants and smugglers were running in trying to make a buck. And Grant got pissed off and expelled all Jews from the areas that he was in, which sounds based at first until you find out that the president caught wind of it. And they even back then were forced to make an apology to the Jews and saying, "Oh, it was horrible that we made you skeevy fuckers stop taking advantage of a battlefield, trying to make a buck with bleeding bodies laying around everywhere." The other example that he gave, I believe, was actually a miss. I don't think this is a. If you read the full piece, I believe it's a misinterpretation of what Mark Twain was saying. Mark Twain was known to be friends with Jews and was a very liberal person. And so he wrote an essay where if you take out of context part of it, it does sound anti-Semitic and whatever. Like the part that it is I'll read this here, which is funny because knowing that he didn't mean it to be, it almost makes it, well, you'll see. It was from an essay called, I believe it was called On the Jews in Harper's Magazine. He says, "The Jew is a money getter, and in getting his money, he is very serious obstruction to less capable, he's a very serious obstruction to less capable neighbors who are on the same quest. I think that is the trouble. In estimating worldly values, the Jew is not shallow but deep. With precocious wisdom, he..."
Want to know why they don't sell this little green laser at the shooting range? Because if you had it, you'd never waste another round zeroing again. No lane fees, no ammo costs, and it only takes 10 seconds to do it at home. This thing is killing their business.
This is the Bore Sighter by MCG Tactical. Drop it into your barrel, turn it on, line it up with your scope with the green laser dot. You just got a perfect zero without firing a single shot. No trips to the range, no guessing, no spending 25 bucks on ammo just to get it on paper. And yeah, it works with every caliber. Your 17 HMR, your 308, even your 12 gauge slug gun. You can use it anywhere, in your office, in your garage, even at camp. No mag, no trigger, just precision. And the best part, you can use it over and over again. Every time you change optics, every time you bump your rifle, every time you want to be sure you're still dialed in. And right now, we've got a limited drop. Normally, these laser sighters run up to $200, but right now, you can grab it for just 55 bucks. Plus, free shipping, and it's backed by a 60-day guarantee. That's cheaper than one range trip, and it could save your shot when it matters most. So you want tight groups and sniper level 0? Then click that link, grab your bore, and get on target. Let's roll out.
Found out in the morning of time that some men worship rank, some worship heroes, some worship power, some worship God, and that over these ideals they dispute and cannot unite, but that they all worship money. So he made it the end and aim of his life to get it. And so he used this as an example, of course, that what he's saying is Jews realize what unified all people, which basically which would give you power with anyone, was money. And so they decided that's what they would prioritize over all else, which I think is actually kind of accurate. It's funny that, again, I don't think he meant this as like an I read the whole thing, and a lot of it's very flattering towards Jews, talking about the great accomplishments they've made, and kind of implies they're better than everybody. But then you get to this, and you're just like, I don't know, it doesn't really sound like they're better than everybody. If they're basically they're prioritizing money over everything else, because they know it'll give them an advantage of other people who are prioritizing rank, or prioritizing heroes, or, which I would say is honor and chivalry, or they're prioritizing power, or they're prioritizing God. And the Jew cracked the code. The Jew figured out that actually all those things bends the need of money. And so that's what I'm going to focus my life on. You can chase chivalry, you can chase honor, you can chase status, you can chase perceived power, you can chase religion and God, but I'm the one that's going to have the money. Again, you read the whole thing, and he means it as a compliment, but it's still pretty fucked up. So this passage is also used as evidence that if this is interpreted as anti-Semitism, clearly this is anti-Semitism that existed well before Hitler.
And the New Deal administration, operating through the Department of Justice, caused 28 American men and women residing in different parts of this country to be indicted, arrested, and taken from their homes to Washington, D.C. for trial in a foreign jurisdiction. Entrapment schemes were used in setting the stage at the nation's capital. This was accomplished by having Dillard Stokes, a reporter on the Washington Post, address letters to the victims under the alias of Jefferson Breen and Quigley Adams, in which he ordered copies of their books, pamphlets, newspapers, and magazines mailed into the District of Columbia. Those victims, marked for destruction, found themselves in a hostile atmosphere where no one could expect to locate jurors who were not in some way, directly or indirectly, obligated to the federal government.
The government. So there's going to be a twist at the end about this operation. So wait for that. This is David Baxter. He's hard to understand. I think he had a stroke because it looks like only half of his face is moving. At first I was like, what the hell kind of accent is that? But I'm almost positive he had a stroke. So you're gonna have to suffer. I'm not gonna make you listen to much of it because it is a little difficult. But he was one of the defendants, and the only person I could find actual footage of that was charged during this case. They would talk about it. But he talks about how it was financially ruinous. It was lawfare. Nothing changes. That's something Mark Twain should have added to his poem. That it's not just money that the Jews prioritize; it's the law. You see, because you don't have to be strong if you control the law. Because if you control the law, you control the goys that enforce the law. That's a little trick that I don't think many people think about. Most people don't look at going into the law profession as something honorable. In fact, to a lot of people, it's considered something kind of slimy and dirty. Probably most likely because of Jewish involvement in the profession. Probably. If I had to guess, gun to the head, I would say that's most likely a huge motivating factor in why so many people view the law profession as like a slimy, scummy profession, because it's full of Jews being kind of slimy and scummy and abusing the law in order to achieve goals and mutate the law in ways that it wasn't meant for. And anyway, so he discusses this. Just kind of suffer. You're gonna have to suffer through his stroke talk, but it is what it is.
A prosecutor later turned out to be a member of the Communist Party and one of Joseph Stalin's 5 best friends. His name was Rojan Rogge. He was a lawyer later on too for the Rosenbergs, and they were tried for delivering our atomic secrets to the Soviet Union.
The trial lasted for over 4 years.
Yeah, so he's talking about some of the people involved in pushing the trial, and there's going to be a bigger twist. Some of the prosecutors were involved with the fucking Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs that stole the atomic bomb and gave it to the Russians. So it was Jewish prosecutors. Look, the FDR, Washington D.C. If you've ever lived in Washington D.C., there are some permanent bureaucrats that'll keep living there, regardless of what administration is there. But a lot of the town completely gets swapped out when administrations change, especially if it's a Democrat administration, because they're just better at it. They know that when they come to town and they get their political appointees into these different bureaucracies, they're not afraid to fire everyone that doesn't believe like them, Republicans are cucks, and so they don't always do that. But, for example, when Obama was elected president, and he went to Washington, D.C., and he appointed all of his political appointees, and they became the heads of these different bureaucracies, they cleaned house. Clinton did the same thing. And in fact, Clinton fired something like a crazy amount of federal prosecutors. There was I think it was in the hundreds. They just fire, because you can, that's part of they all serve at the pleasure of the president, right? That's part of the power that Trump had and didn't use. He could have easily gone over there, gone into DC and essentially fired anyone. He's their boss. But anyway, so that's what happens is they go in, they fire everybody and hire all the people, loyalists, people that believe like they do. And so when you've got a administration like FDR's, where it's super Jewy, and it's not just that they had to go in there and fire all these heads of these bureaucracies. Those bureaucracies didn't exist before FDR. So a lot of these organizations now exist because of FDR. So they're not just headed up by people he appointed. Like everyone in the organization was hired by FDR and his pack of Jews. So you've got the federal government is that whole town. It's even if the prosecutor wasn't Jewish and the judge wasn't Jewish and everybody else wasn't Jewish, if you ever go to a jury trial, they're going to pull from people that work for the federal government because it's Washington, D.C. So who do you think lives there? And so it's going to be Jews that work at all these brand new organizations. And so, you really don't stand a chance. So that's basically what he was saying, is that even some of the people that were involved with prosecuting ended up being literal, Jewish spies.
With Judge Eicher presiding over the case, just before the case was thrown out of court, Judge Eicher died in his sleep, and another observing judge, Honorable Chief Justice Bolivia J. Laws, declared it to be a travesty upon justice.
The judge said, that is a travesty upon justice. He said every one of the defendants are victims of a travesty upon justice. He said the case dismissed against all of them. Case dismissed. That's the way I wound up. But it ruined most of us financially. So the government can afford to try you whether they have any evidence or not. They can ruin you financially and use you to frighten anyone else that might be tempted to resist them.
So to translate there, God killed the Jew judge. Anyway, so the corrupt judge that was letting this go on died in his sleep, and the Goy judge that took over was like, "What the fuck is this? This is insane. Like you can't do this. Like none of this makes any sense." Again, we'll get to why it even got this far at the end here.
Among the defendants were several members of the Nazi German American Bunds. Just as the order members during the Fort Smith trial, these men in general had already been convicted of other crimes and were serving many years in prison already.
They really did some hanky-panky with respect to grouping together men like, say, from the German-American Bund during World War II, who had already been convicted of other crimes and put into prison. And they then lumped together with them Christian ministers such as Gerald Winrod, Elizabeth Dilling, who was a marvelous Christian lady who wrote the book The Plot Against Christianity. And in all probability, that was the reason she was there as a defendant in the trial.
A few of the charges that the government made in the 24-point indictment include the following statements that the defendants were reported to have said or written.
The government of the United States, the Congress and public officials are controlled by communists, international Jews, and plutocrats. The present war is a dishonest war waged at the expense and measured in the blood and dollars of the people of the United States solely for the benefit of and to ensure the continuance of world domination by international bankers, international capitalists, Mongolian Jews, communists, and international Jewry. An honorable and just peace could be brought about speedily were it not for the opposition of the communists, international Jewry, and war profiteers.
Now, these proceedings did not pass without public and legislative protest. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio gave a lengthy castigation of the government's attempt to convict these men and women. Committees were organized and operated on a national scale, which were made up of pastors and laymen opposing these convictions. They realized that the government wanted to browbeat into silence every man and woman of God who might dare to lift a voice against strong central government and communism.
So they lucked out that judge died. It got thrown out. But as he said, with his stroke voice, many of them were ruined financially. They were all, they were kept in holding cells in federal prison in Washington, D.C. They had to pay for lawyers, and just it was a nightmare. It went on for a long time. But then we get this little nugget here. Baxter, the guy with the stroke, later later wrote an article many years later talking about some Freedom of Information Act requests that the FBI finally responded to. He wanted to know why he was selected. He had written a book. I forget the name of it now. I thought I had it here, but he had written a book about, basically powerful Jews in the United States government. But he wanted to know specifically why he was targeted, why the others were targeted, what kind of FBI investigation had even gone on. And this is the kind of thing that you might ask today, right? When we wonder, like, are the feds watching my show? Or, do I have a file? I'm sure I do. I'm sure there's a file, a Devon Stack file over at the FBI. What's in that file? Maybe in 30 years I'll be able to send it an FOI and I'll be able to get some of those answers. And so that's what he did, is he wanted to know what exactly was this investigation all about and who was behind it. This is a portion of the article here. Actually, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, was the catalyst behind the entire sedition trial. So in other words, B'nai B'rith, the secret society, the ADL, Chabad Lubavitch, was behind the trial. But behind the entire sedition trial. I couldn't prove it then, but I can now. A few years ago, I demanded through the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI turn over to me its investigation records of my activities during the early 1940s, leading up to the sedition trial. I learned that the investigation had extended over several years and covered hundreds of pages, which I now have. The FBI blocked out the names of those who had given information about me, much of it is as false as anything could be. I was never given a chance to face these people and make them prove their accusations. Yet everything they said went into the investigation records. Oddly enough, in a great many cases, it wasn't the FBI that had conducted the investigation, but the Anti-Defamation League. The FBI merely received the reports of the ADL investigators. One can hardly tell from the reports whether a given person was an FBI or an ADL agent. But at the time, all this was so hush-hush that I didn't even suspect the web spinning going on around me. I hadn't considered myself that important. Anyone who wishes to inspect my FBI file is welcome to do so. It's a masterpiece of intrigue, cunning, and deception, and it's available online now. You can get that stuff. So that's not really different either. It's like when you get the FBI statistics on anti-Semitic incidents, that's just data that they're getting from the ADL. The ADL has been working with the FBI in this role since before the 1940s. And for all we know, that's precisely the people giving them reports today. We know that this was still the case up and through the 90s and early 2000s. We've had other cases where this was exactly, very similar situation. The FBI gets their source of the hate crimes is, well, the ADL told us. And of course it has to be true. The ADL told us. Hate crimes are on the rise. How do we know? The ADL told us. It's not actually any kind of like FBI statistic where we're gathering this information from local law enforcement or anywhere else, any official government records. It's the ADL providing the information. And in this case, the ADL was giving them these bogus investigation reports to FBI agents who apparently work for the ADL. So it's yet another thing that hasn't changed. And this is why it's important. This is why when people ask you, well, why do you talk about Jews all the time? Well, I don't know. Seems a little bit relevant. Seems a little bit relevant since both my grandfathers had to leave their families, risk their lives overseas. One of them got malaria and almost died when he was in Africa, fighting wars that we would never have gone into in the first place had people been talking about Jews. In fact, had people been talking about Jews before the turn of the century, accurately assessing their ability to assimilate, they might not have been welcomed in at all. Hollywood might be something completely different. 99% of the founders of Hollywood were Jewish immigrants that came from Eastern Europe around the turn of the century. If that wave of immigrants had not happened, Hollywood would have been Christian. It would have been WASPs. How do I know this? Because the reason why Hollywood exists in the first place is it was the furthest point from New York they could find because they stole the technology from Edison, who was in New York, and were avoiding patent lawsuits. That's why they went to the other fucking side of the country. Edison would have been the one creating that industry. We would have had totally different movies. We would have had, CBS, the head of CBS, the head of NBC, both Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe around the turn of the century. All of our news gathering and reporting would have been completely different over the last century. You don't think that's relevant? Look, you might like that. If you're a Jew, you probably think it's awesome. But you can't pretend that doesn't make a difference. That doesn't change the course of history. The reason why we talk about Jews so much is because if you're talking about politics and you're not mentioning Jews, what are you even talking about? If you're talking about culture and you're not mentioning Jews, what are you even talking about? If you're talking about technology and you're not talking about Jews now in the age of Silicon Valley, when we have Jewish heads of so many different technology companies, including some of the most relevant, ChatGPT, Sam Altman, Mark Zuckerberg, Google, if you're not talking about Jews, what are you talking about? And it doesn't matter because apparently,
No joke. Don't try the bull trick before bed unless you're ready to stay as hard as a steel bar all night long. Every time you see an older man leaving a younger woman breathless, you can bet he's using the bull trick. I've been left unable to walk for over 4 days because of it. This talk about women only caring about money is just an excuse from guys who can't get the job done. What women really want is a man who's good in bed and can keep his stamina going all night. The bull trick is so powerful it can turn any man into a real machine, even if he's 80 years old. And all of this is scientifically proven by medical experts. The trick makes your body stay firm whenever you want. And the best part? It's completely natural. All you need to do is follow the 30-second ritual with the right ingredients. It's curious, isn't it? This trick was kept secret for centuries because it threatens the profits of big pharmaceutical companies. But now you can have access to it. I just don't know for how long. Tap the Learn More button below and see how it works. A heads up. Watch this video alone because it includes intense practical demonstrations. You'll see exactly how the bull trick can transform your performance. The results are so impressive that I'm left speechless when I think about what it's done for my husband. So tap Learn More now and get ready to discover the secret that can change everything.
according to this Freedom of Information Act request, even if you're not talking about Jews, it turns out Jews are talking about you to the FBI. So Robert Edward Edmondson, his big, I guess, manifesto, if you will, is I testify against the Jews. Some of it's, like I said, some of it's inaccurate in terms of, I don't think intentionally. I think that he just had limited access to information as one would back in the 1940s, you know what I mean? He's going to make some mistakes. He's going to draw some wrong conclusions based on limited data. But it was one of the first Americans to respond in a way that was influential to the Jewish infestation of the American power structure. He was one of the first Americans to actually make ripples like that. And you got to admire him for making, that was his life's work. I don't think he ever had a family. I think he died kind of in obscurity, not a lot of money, because he'd been attacked with lawfare, and this was his obsession. He thought he was a reporter by trade, and he had the biggest story. He just needed Americans to read it. And it wasn't for nothing. A lot of his work would go on to inspire people like William Luther Pierce. William Luther Pierce would cite him as being the inspiration for a lot of his later writings. So that's I guess that's part of the story. The part that I was able to research, given my limitations with archive.org and everything else being down, and just a lot of this stuff being kind of memory hold. But that's it. Part of the story of Robert E. Edmondson. I'll tell you what, it did open up a lot of other little rabbit holes that I'm going to be drilling down further. And in fact, I was thinking I might even, if I get the time, because one thing I do have is I have a lot of newspaper articles about that sedition trial. And so a lot of it's very adversarial, obviously. A lot of it's very slanderous, quite frankly. A lot of it's lying. It's Jews lying about, their perceived enemies. In fact, one of the articles I found, it was so petty, but it kind of really shows you what we're up against. It shows you how the attitude of the Jews that oppose us, it hasn't changed. It's like I said, there's so many parallels between this era of anti-Semitism and today. I found the obituary of Robert Edmondson, or not really the obituary. It was some, I think, editor of a newspaper writing basically dancing on his grave after he had died. He wrote an article talking about, well, there's one more dead anti-Semite, and luckily there's not very many springing up to replace him. The age of the anti-Semite is over, and we're glad that he's dead. And in the article, they say he was indicted for treason, and I was like, no, he wasn't. Like there's a big difference between the sedition trial that took place and treason. Treason is what the Rosenbergs were convicted of, and they got the chair because they were Jewish communists that stole the atomic bomb. Treason is what Pollard should have got, and he should have got the chair. But by that time, Jews had enough influence to prevent anything like that from happening. But they wrote that he was indicted on charges of treason. And then I found another article like a week later from the same newspaper, the same editor, forced to write a retraction because I guess friends of Edmondson had written in and said, no, he wasn't. He was He was indicted on charges of sedition, but he was acquitted. He was never indicted on charges of treason. And the Jewish newspaperman decided to be cute and wrote this really backhanded, retraction about, I guess I got it wrong, but is there really, I guess it's actually worse because the difference between treason is you actually have the balls to do it, and sedition is just you talk about it but won't do it. So he's actually kind of a pussy. It was like you fucking disgusting little faggot. But that's how they are. That's how they are. Anyway, I hope this was a little informative, and I guess we'll take a look over here at Hyperchats. Let me pop this out here. Oh wait, there we go. Check out Odyssey first. All right, we got Gorilla Hands. Gorilla Hands says, "Good morning, Devin. I have to work early in the morning, so I will have to be on the replay gang. Looks like Israel and our astute members of Congress are getting us closer to World War III. Well, look at that. We were just talking about that. Look, it's possible. I hope that it doesn't happen for a variety of reasons, but it is. I look, especially after doing the research for this, there's lots of echoes, more than usual. World War III, really sad and frustrating considering I was hoping to be exploring the solar system by now. Well, I'll tell you what. I think we were born in that awkward phase, and it's like what people say, right? We were born too late to explore the Earth and born too early to explore the stars. And I'm confident that humans, specifically white people, will explore the stars, just not when I'm alive. I suspect that we'll make it to Mars while I'm alive, but not, there's not going to be like a colony there or anything like that. But I suspect we'll put a person there before I die. And maybe something on the moon. I don't know what, but maybe something. It'll happen. You're right, though. If you were to get all the money that we have spent on foreign aid and on Jewish tricks, we'll just do that. If you were to get all the money that we spent on Jewish tricks, and put that towards a space program, we'd already have like a colony on Mars. So thanks, Jews.